Podrick Payne was never the sort of lad who demanded attention. He had an odd, unassuming quality to him, a quietness that had been beaten into his bones long before his first true battle. Timid around lords and wary around knights, he often slipped through corridors and common rooms like a ghost. For one so young, his haunted look was a mixture of perpetual surprise and earnest devotion, emotions that, for him, ran side by side. Even now, long after the wars that tore the Seven Kingdoms asunder, he was given to lingering silences in which he seemed to listen for a different sort of call. Many believed it was the resonance of the gods. Others claimed it was simply the echo of all the near-death experiences he had survived. But Podrick himself never claimed to know which it was. He could only go on serving, living, and holding tight to the meager hope he had gleaned during times of impossible despair. He was Pod to those few friends who truly understood the worth of his loyalty. To the rest, he was a boy knight squire, or a curious relic of Lord Tyrion Lannister's retinue, or that quiet fellow who bore the name Payne, despite seeming nothing like the infamous royal headsman, Ser Islan. But beneath those layers of meekness, behind the soft voice and large, watchful eyes, there was a spirit tempered by an uncanny blend of fortune, faith, and the unwavering sense of duty that had been his since childhood. And that spirit, for reasons not even a maester's greatest wisdom could unravel, seemed undeniably charmed. Some whispered that the stranger had passed him by the day he was born, disinterested in claiming the life of one so unimportant. Others insisted the father had taken pity on him, seeing the flickers of devotion in his heart. Still others told tales of the maiden's protection, as Podrick's pure nature might have attracted that aspect of the Seven. Whether he was spared by chance or chosen by the gods, he had endured hardships no ordinary squire would have lived through. From the Battle of the Blackwater to the long, terrible road with Brienne of Tarth, from the horrors of Winterfell to the final, desperate conflicts that bled the realm dry, Podrick Payne had survived them all. He had been little more than a boy when he first entered Tyrion Lannister's service. Underneath Tyrion's shadow, he found a curious sort of mentor, one who both protected him and used him as a lens into the world of power and politics. There had been nights when Podrick lay awake in his small bunk, listening to the distant roars of carousing from the Dwarf Lord's chambers, uncertain whether he should remain on guard outside or try to sink deeper into blessed, dreamless slumber. Yet he always found himself on duty, wanting to fulfill his tasks, whether that meant fetching wine, carrying messages, or shielding the man he served from threats. For a time it was enough, until the war swirled around him like a hungry tide. Podrick was there at the Blackwater when the sea seemed to catch fire, and the screams of men drowned out every rational thought. Tyrion had survived the inferno and the subsequent chaos by a hair's breadth, but what startled everyone was that Podrick had marched away largely unscathed. He was doused in sweat and grime, reeking of smoke and the stench of fear, but he was whole and alive. On that blistering battlefield, men far better trained and better armed perished in the blink of an eye. But Podrick Payne, a squire with a name that most people spat or feared, emerged with only a graze across his forearm. Veterans of many campaigns shook their heads, wondering what trick of fate the boy possessed. No one thought to ask Podrick himself, for he could only shrug and say he had done his duty. He had, in truth, done more than that. He had saved Tyrion from an attacker on the field, stabbing a knight in full armor through a joint where the plates parted at the neck, surprising even himself. The knight, enraged, had swung back, but Podrick somehow slipped aside at the last instant. Such was the boy's innocence that, afterward, he fretted more over the man he had killed than over his own brush with death. Yet as time passed, more saw that curious miracle for what it might have been. A sign that something or someone watched over Podrick Payne. He was a squire who bumbled over words, had an endearing awkwardness about him, and yet walked unhurt through carnage that chewed up seasoned fighters in minutes. It went on like that again and again. Wherever Podrick went, war or rumors of war followed. Yet he remained standing, a testament to either extraordinary fortune or a greater design by the Seven. It perplexed him greatly, especially once he found himself in the charge of Brienne of Tarth. The tall, formidable woman was fearless, and her righteous moral center drew him the way a lodestar calls to a weary traveler. Where Tyrion's cynicism and cunning had overshadowed Podrick's pure nature, Brienne's honor and devotion illuminated it. Traveling as her squire, Podrick discovered something within himself. Hope, perhaps, or faith that his survival might serve a higher purpose. They had scoured the war-torn countryside in search of the Stark girls, Sansa and Arya, though leads often turned cold as swiftly as they formed. Podrick learned to ride longer hours, to endure hunger when food was scarce, and to face the leers of brigands without flinching. He learned from Brienne what it truly meant to protect and to promise. The Maiden of Tarth, as some called her behind her back, might have seemed an odd shield for a slight boy, but for Podrick, she was the embodiment of the very virtues the Seven extolled. She had no illusions about the cruelty of the world, yet she forged ahead, guided by oaths and a code of conduct that shamed lesser knights. During those travels, Podrick came close to death countless times. Ambushes from outlaws, savage raids, betrayals. Once, they were accosted in the thick of a forest by a party of Sellswords who saw two travelers as easy prey. Brienne's sword was a blinding arc of steel, and she felled two of the Sellswords in the rush of the first exchange. Podrick tried to hold his own, but his sword seemed to weigh 1,000 stones in his trembling hand. He barely managed a few frantic parries before tripping over a tree root. The Sellsword who lunged at him missed by a hair, the blade whistling inches from Podrick's ear to embed itself in the trunk. By the time the man wrenched it free, Brienne had spun around and run him through with her long sword. One heartbeat later, the fight was over. Podrick lay there, panting. He felt certain that, had the Seven not granted him that miraculous backward stumble, he would have been parted from his head. Brienne, though she never called him incompetent, sometimes worried aloud that the boy's reflexes were lacking. To her mind, he needed more training, more drilling, more experience, but she saw something else in him that no amount of swordplay could explain. Each time Podrick escaped death, the sense that some unseen force shielded him grew. With each skirmish, that sense deepened until even Brienne, pragmatic, rooted in real steel and real blood, seemed to acknowledge that fortune stood by him in an eerie, almost preternatural way. When Podrick's life threatened to spin into darkness, when every worldly calculation suggested he should be dead, he somehow found another path. It was as though the gods themselves whispered into the ear of every enemy's horse, or angled the blade of every adversary just so. The number of times he wound up on the ground, sure he was about to feel the lethal bite of steel, was countless. Yet he always rose. Rumors spread through taverns and camps. The lad with the big, innocent eyes, who wore the same battered cloak day in and day out, had a charmed fate. Some men laughed about it, claiming that if a boy as green as that kept returning alive, it was proof that those he served must be favored indeed. Others grew superstitious and scornful, wanting no part of him. A charmed child, after all, could be a lightning rod for curses if the god's fancy ever soured. Podrick remained humble. He prayed in small septs along the road whenever Brienne allowed a brief stop for rest. He would stand before the alcoves of the Seven, eyes lowered, lips moving in silent supplication. He had no illusions of grandeur about the Father's judgment, the stranger's domain, or the warrior's guiding hand, but he felt an inexplicable closeness to the Maiden, perhaps because Brienne herself evoked that protective grace. When he offered up his prayers, it was always for the well-being of those he served and the redemption of those who had been led astray. In the fractured land, vengeance consumed the hearts of so many, yet Podrick prayed that the gods might grant him the strength to protect rather than punish. Was that, perhaps, why he was spared time and time again? The notion found new breath when Podrick followed Brienne north, eventually coming to Winterfell in the wake of conflicts that nearly razed the Seven Kingdoms to rubble. He heard rumor after rumor. The Starks had retaken their ancestral seat. The Lannisters were entangled in new power struggles. Dragons soared again in the east and west alike. Each corner of the realm was ablaze with gossip of the final battles against the Night King, of the living uniting to face the onslaught of the dead. Podrick traveled those roads, filled with dread and hope in equal measure, uncertain how he could possibly survive what so many believed would be the end of all things. But at the heart of that bleakness, he carried a secret certainty that he would stand. The faith that had taken root in him, call it the Seven's blessing or simply a quiet refusal to die, sparked a fire in him. At Brienne's side, he found himself forging onward even when lesser men turned away. He marched into Winterfell's courtyard with a trembling heart but a steadfast grip on his battered sword. He gazed upon the old castle, its thick walls black with centuries of northern storms, and felt a calling. To defend this place, these people, from the darkness that threatened to devour the world. When the long night came, and the dead swarmed across the plains, the defenders of Winterfell huddled behind the ramparts. Podrick took his place among the lines, just another sword in a sea of trembling souls. The night was dark and terrible, the screams of the living blending with the moan of the dead. Torches and pitch set the horizon aflame, but the onslaught came relentless. Even in that chaos, the same hand of fortune seemed to guide Podrick's every step. He was no hero of legendary skill. He stumbled more than once, lost his shield after a vicious blow from an undead warrior, and felt the cold of the grave close around his heart with every near miss. Yet each time, it was as though something or someone nudged him out of harm's way. An arrow meant for his chest was deflected by a hapless soldier stepping into its path at the last second. A wight's rusted blade slipped past his guard but caught on a kink in the links of his chainmail. The next blow that should have taken his head ended when a dire wolf barreled in, knocking the monstrous undead aside. All around Podrick, knights and soldiers fell, good men and women whose names he never learned. But he kept fighting, kept breathing, kept living. Each heartbeat felt like a gift. When dawn finally broke and the dead were driven back, Podrick stood, battered and caked in gore, but alive. In the aftermath, as the survivors gathered to mourn, men looked at Podrick with dawning amazement. In a single night, he had been saved from certain death time and time again. He was not unscathed. His arm bled from 3 nasty gashes, and a blow to his helm had left him concussed for a day. But the fact he yet drew breath while so many had perished seemed a sign. Even Lady Brienne, who had scolded him for nearly being overrun, could not hide the relief and curious awe that flickered in her eyes. There was something miraculous about him, something that had saved him in the face of an apocalyptic threat. He himself prayed in the small gods' wood of Winterfell, uncertain which aspect to thank, uncertain if the old gods had taken pity on him instead. Perhaps all the gods had a hand in it, perhaps none did, but the question lingered, surfacing in the quiet hours. Why was he still alive? When the dust of that war finally settled, Podrick found himself, for the first time, without a clear direction. No longer Tyrion's squire, not quite a formal knight. He had served Brienne faithfully, but with the realm forging a new peace, he wondered about his place in it. Many were given titles, lands, or at least recognition for their service. Podrick, uncertain as always, accepted whatever tasks came his way, aiding in small errands around the north. He rarely considered the possibility that his life might have greater significance. He was only Podrick Payne, after all, a quiet boy among lords who reshaped the realm's destiny. Yet there were signs. Whispers circulated that a boy with the Payne name walked as though guided by the gods. Some claimed that, in the chaotic hours of the final battle, they had seen a faint glow about him, a trick of the torchlight that lingered longer than it should have. Others swore that wherever Podrick went, the air felt lighter, as though fear itself was held at bay by an unseen presence. Such rumors were half laughed at by those who saw him tripping over his own feet during arms practice. But the seeds of legend had begun to germinate. Podrick, unknowing of any grander design, continued to serve. He was assigned to Brienne's retinue when she traveled south to settle affairs with the new powers in King's Landing. The capital had changed. The Red Keep still rose high above the city, but the effects of war and new leadership had altered the dynamic. Tension and hope intermingled in the streets. As Brienne went about her duties, Podrick often found himself wandering the alleys and markets. He had few illusions about the capital. He remembered the cruelty and the political games that had once thrived there. But perhaps in this new age there was a chance for something better. One evening, he found his way to the Great September of Baylor, rebuilt after the destruction wrought by wildfire years ago. It was smaller now, less grand, but the faithful had reclaimed it with fervor. Podrick entered quietly, for his curiosity about the seven had grown. He felt drawn to them, not in the typical manner of those who hoped for blessings, but in a solemn way, as though asking for an explanation he dared not voice aloud. Light from 100 flickering candles danced over the carved faces of the father, the mother, the warrior, the maiden, the smith, the crone, and the stranger. Podrick's gaze lingered on the maiden's figure for a time before drifting to the stranger. He shuddered, recalling all the times the stranger's hand might have claimed him and did not. Dropping to his knees, he whispered a prayer. It was not a request for gold or glory, but a humble plea for wisdom. "Why me?" The words echoed in his mind more than the stone around him. Perhaps he hoped for a sign, but none came. Instead, he simply found a measure of peace. Sometimes that was enough. In the following days, people in King's Landing began to take notice of him in small ways. A woman in the Street of Flower recognized him from the war and claimed he had healed her child's fever by gently placing a hand on the boy's brow. The story was mostly her invention, for Podrick had merely offered to fetch a maester when the boy collapsed. But rumor spread quickly, turning an act of concern into a miracle. Another rumor claimed Podrick's presence had cured a horse's lameness simply by leading it gently along the street, though in truth, the horse only needed a stone removed from its hoof. The city, always eager for legends and gossip, latched onto him. Some called him the Blessed Payne in jest, while others began bowing their heads in awkward reverence when he passed. Podrick was so mortified he started wearing his hood more often. He tried to dismiss it. "They're just stories," he told Brienne one afternoon. "None of it's true. I'm no miracle worker." Brienne, though exasperated with the silliness, laid a gauntlet hand on his shoulder. "Be that as it may," she said softly. "You have a knack for surviving, Pod. Men will always make more of that than you intend. Don't let it lead you astray. You remain who you are, a loyal squire, a good lad. Keep your feet on the ground, no matter what names they call you." Podrick nodded, relieved by her practical counsel. But that very night, the talk grew louder. After Brienne's audience with the king and queen, they attended a small feast in the keep's hall. In that gathering, lords and ladies cast curious glances at Podrick. While the realm's future was still uncertain, while alliances were forged and old enmities set aside, the boy squire, grown older now but still overshadowed by so many, was a subject of hushed conversation. Some had heard rumors from the Blackwater about how he had saved Tyrion Lannister's life. Others recalled how he survived the final battles unscathed. A handful spoke of his silent prayers in septs and how it seemed the seven answered him more often than they answered others. Podrick, wholly unprepared for such scrutiny, stuttered through awkward greetings. When Lord Giles of Rosby asked if it was true that the gods had shielded him personally, Podrick nearly choked on his wine. "No, my lord," he managed at length. "I only did as I was told. I'm no one special." That humility only fanned the flames. Some were eager to see if a new holy figure might emerge from the ashes of war. Others, more cautious, suspected it was all nonsense. Still, curiosity clung to him like a second skin. Even lords who might have brushed off such rumors felt compelled to test him. One such test came in the form of a sparring match in the Red Keep's yard. A knight from the Stormlands, curious about the boy's so-called divine luck, challenged Podrick to friendly practice. Podrick, with no choice but to oblige, grabbed a blunted sword. The crowd that gathered expected a quick defeat for the awkward squire. But once again, fate intervened in bizarre ways. Each time the Stormlands knight lunged, Podrick stumbled or shifted at just the right moment, turning what should have been a ringing blow to his helm into a glancing swipe. Twice, when he swung the blade in desperation, it struck the knight's shield at an angle and slid off harmlessly. Yet the knight, overconfident, overextended, and Podrick's next uncertain strike hammered into his thigh, toppling him. The watchers burst into incredulous cheers and laughter. It was hardly a decisive display of skill, but the onlookers were quick to call it uncanny. The Stormlands knight picked himself up, rubbing his bruised leg, unable to explain how Podrick had bested him. Podrick, thoroughly embarrassed, could only apologize, but the murmur that the seven must surely guide his hand spread all the more. Days turned to weeks, and Podrick wished fervently to leave the capital and return to a simpler life. Yet at the same time, a kernel of thought took root in his mind. If the gods had plans for him, might it not be wise to learn what they were? The realm had lost so many heroes. Perhaps the future demanded new ones, in shapes not yet imagined. He found himself praying in the sept once more, this time laying a trembling hand against the statue of the maiden, feeling the cool stone beneath his palm. He closed his eyes and tried to sense a presence. Nothing tangible moved through him, but his heart pounded with an unexplainable intensity. Late that evening, Brienne informed him they would soon depart for Riverrun, where rumors of an uprising demanded attention. Podrick felt relief. The capital's eyes weighed on him like a yoke, and he yearned to breathe freer air. The next morning, they rode out, accompanied by a handful of soldiers tasked with investigating the rumors. The road took them past wide green fields and ruined villages still struggling to rebuild. Everywhere they went, the scars of war stood out stark and fresh, even though the war had ended. Podrick's heart ached at the sight of burnt farms and unmarked graves. If he truly was chosen for something, he thought, it should be to help these people rebuild their lives. He paused one afternoon when they came across a small group of villagers trying to raise the walls of a new September. The structure was modest, barely more than a single large room with open arches for windows. The traveling party almost passed it by, but Podrick asked Brienne for leave to stay a while. She agreed, though the others grumbled about losing daylight. Podrick dismounted and offered his assistance to the villagers. They were few in number, lacking strong hands and supplies, but determined to erect a place where they could pray. The mother among them, an older woman with kind eyes, recognized the Payne name and clutched Podrick's hands. "It said you bear the blessings of the seven," she murmured, her voice wavering with both awe and desperation. "We beg you, could you say a prayer for our sept, so it stands firm?" Podrick wanted to refuse, to tell her that he was no priest, that his luck or blessings, if they existed at all, didn't extend to walls of wood and stone. But the fervor in her eyes, the hope he saw in the battered faces of the other villagers, stopped him. What harm could it do? So he lowered his head, closing his eyes, and let the soft words of an old septon's blessing come back to him, a memory from boyhood. As he spoke, the wind seemed to settle. The only sound was the rustle of leaves and the muffled steps of the soldiers behind him. When he finished, the villagers thanked him profusely. They resumed their work, and as Podrick looked around, he saw that the alignment of the beams had improved after they measured them again. Perhaps the forced calm of a simple prayer had allowed them to concentrate. Yet from their excited expressions, he knew they believed it was the Seven's intercession, channeled through him. Unsure how to disabuse them of that notion without seeming cruel, he simply wished them luck and carried on his way. But the incident lingered in his mind. Faith, he realized, was a powerful thing, one that could drive people to survive the worst hardships. If even a fraction of that faith was placed in him, what did it mean? They reached Riverrun after days of hard travel. The fortress stood proud by the confluence of rivers, though it too bore scars from past sieges. The rumored uprising turned out to be little more than a few bands of brigands stirring unrest. Brienne saw to the negotiations, demonstrating the letter of authority she carried. In her wake, Podrick helped with menial chores, delivering messages and offering reassurance to frightened peasants. But among them, his name had traveled faster than he had, and they called him Ser Podrick, much to his mortification. He wasn't knighted, though he had learned enough about knighthood from Brienne to know the vow was more than a ceremony. Yet each time he corrected them, they only smiled. In the courtyard of Riverrun, as the tension simmered, a new test of Podrick's charmed nature revealed itself. A group of disgruntled sellswords, who had lost their contract when the local lord refused to meet their high price, decided to cause havoc. They snuck inside the fortress under the guise of petitioners, armed with hidden daggers. When they launched their attack, seeking to seize the castellan, chaos erupted. Podrick, delivering a scroll at the time, found himself caught between the sellswords and their target. There was no time to think. Instinct propelled him forward, a half-formed cry escaping his lips. He grabbed a chair and flung it at the nearest attacker, tripping him. Another sellsword lunged, blade flashing. Podrick, fumbling for his short sword, only managed to draw in time to parry a wild slash. Then a second attacker charged at Pod's back. It should have been the end for him, but a brazier, knocked over in the initial scuffle, spilled glowing coals across the stones. The second sellsword slipped on them, shrieking as the hot embers scorched his skin. That gave Podrick the chance to pivot, landing a desperate blow with the hilt of his sword on the man's temple. Meanwhile, the first sellsword recovered, only to be tackled by a guard who had seen Podrick stand and raced to help. Moments later, the would-be assassins were subdued. The castellan was wide-eyed, stammering his thanks, and the guards swarmed around, patting Podrick on the back. Brienne arrived in a flurry, having heard the shouting. She questioned the guards, who recounted how Podrick had saved the castellan. They spoke as if the young man had single-handedly orchestrated the entire defense. Podrick, face red and breath short, tried to explain it was only luck. He insisted he had been terrified, but no one listened. The story, as tales often do, grew in each retelling, painting Podrick as an instrument of the Seven, guided by unseen hands to protect the innocent. The castellan gave him an ornate dagger as a token of gratitude. He even offered to speak on Podrick's behalf if ever he wanted lands or a formal knighthood. In the days that followed, Podrick found it harder and harder to disclaim these legends swirling around him. Each time he woke with nightmares, remembering how close he had come to death, the swirling doubts battered his mind. Why was he alive? Did the Seven truly watch over him, or was it all just a bizarre roll of the dice? He confided in Brienne one evening, as they sat beside a quiet hearth. "I never asked for this," he said, voice trembling. "I just want to do my duty, same as anyone. But the more they say I'm blessed, the more afraid I get. Afraid it's a lie. Afraid they'll see me fail one day and turn on me." Brienne looked at him with compassion and said, "I can't pretend to know the mind of the gods, Pod, but I do know that you have a good heart, and hearts like yours can give people hope. That's not something to shy away from. If the Seven have some design for you, you'll find it in your own time. And if not, you'll still be the man who tries his best for others." Her words brought comfort, at least for a moment. Yet the realm had a tendency to impose destiny on those who never wanted it. Podrick found that out again when, upon their departure from Riverrun, the castellan insisted that Podrick lead a small escort of men to quell a lingering group of bandits nearby. It was a gesture of respect, almost a challenge to see if his so-called blessing would hold. Podrick tried to refuse, but Brienne, seeing an opportunity for him to gain confidence, encouraged him to go, assuring him that he'd have capable soldiers at his side. So, with a reluctant heart, Podrick rode out. He had never commanded men before. They were only a handful, for soldiers in battered mail, but they looked to him for direction, calling him Ser Podrick despite his protest. At the edge of a dense wood, they found the bandits, more hungry than malicious, holed up in a dilapidated shack. Podrick approached with caution, calling out that they should surrender. He offered them the choice to lay down their arms and come peacefully to Riverrun, where they might receive a fair hearing. The bandits laughed, mocking the young knight. One loosed an arrow that hissed past Podrick's ear. Instantly, his soldiers charged. The skirmish was brief. Most of the bandits fled into the woods. One lunged at Podrick, brandishing an axe. Podrick's sword felt heavy in his grip, but he managed a panicked swing that knocked the axe aside. The man snarled, pivoting for another blow, only to be tackled by one of Podrick's men. Within minutes, the surviving bandits were chased off or captured. None of Podrick's party was badly wounded. Seemed too easy, another near miracle. When they returned to Riverrun, the Castellan commended Podrick, praising his leadership. Word spread. Podrick Payne, protected by the Seven, had once again prevailed without a single loss. Wherever Pod went, more and more people treated him with reverence. He saw the adulation in their faces, but also the hunger. They needed a symbol of hope. They needed to believe the gods still took an interest in mortal lives after so many disasters. It weighed on him like an invisible cloak, suffocating in its intensity. He felt unworthy of such faith, worried that one misstep would shatter their illusions. When they finally departed Riverrun, heading back to King's Landing, the roads were peaceful. Brienne noticed how quiet Podrick had become. She questioned him, but he struggled to articulate the blend of guilt and confusion gnawing at him. Ever perceptive, Brienne did not press. She only assured him that he would always have a place at her side, no matter what paths opened for him. He nodded, grateful, yet the thoughts kept circling. Each step of his horse seemed to echo with the question, what if he truly was destined for something greater? He remembered Tyrion Lannister once saying, in a moment of rare candor, that the gods like to toy with mortals. Perhaps, Podrick mused, this was all a game to them. He pictured the statues of the Seven, flickering in candlelight, gazing down at him with inscrutable expressions. If they had chosen him, why a Payne of all names, of all families? Was it because he was the polar opposite of Ser Islan, who had been a mute agent of death, while Podrick stumbled through life bringing small mercies and improbable victories? Or was it simply that the Seven cherished the humble over the proud? The questions had no easy answers. Back in King's Landing, the tales of Podrick's exploits in Riverrun preceded him. Highborn and small folk alike spoke of him as though he were a new champion of the faith. The newly reconstituted faith militant took an interest, discreetly sending a few sparrows to observe him. Podrick found that disconcerting, especially when they began to follow him around the city, whispering about how he might herald a new era of piety. He took to wearing plain clothes to hide, but inevitably, someone would point and whisper, "There he is," and the hush would spread, faces turning toward him in curiosity. Then came a day that would forever solidify the notion of Podrick's blessing in the hearts of the people. A fire broke out in Flea Bottom, raging through a cluster of rickety huts. Smoke rose in thick plumes, and the alarm bells rang as city watchmen rushed to contain the blaze. Podrick, who had only ridden to that part of the city to help deliver food supplies from the Red Keep, found himself in the midst of panicked crowds. Flames licked at the rooftops, and men and women scrambled for buckets of water. A child's scream cut through the roar of the fire. Without hesitation, Podrick plunged into the chaos. Perhaps it was foolish, perhaps it was the intangible sense of duty that overshadowed his fear. But he sprinted toward the sound, weaving between collapsing beams and cinders swirling in the air. He found a young boy, trapped beneath a fallen rafter, eyes wild with terror. Podrick coughed in the thick smoke, his eyes stinging, but managed to hoist the timber enough to free the boy's leg. With a desperate tug, he pulled the child away from the blaze. A moment later, another creaking moan echoed above them. The adjacent hovel's roof caved in, sending a shower of burning debris. In a single heartbeat, Podrick twisted, covering the child with his own body. Splinters, sparks, and a few flaming embers rained down. He felt a surge of searing heat against his back but refused to move until the onslaught ceased. When the worst passed, he rose, trembling, expecting to feel the scorch of agony. But aside from a singed patch on his cloak and a blistering burn on his shoulder, he was miraculously unharmed. Pain seared him, but it was not fatal. Gathering the crying boy in his arms, he staggered out of the collapsing structure. Onlookers gasped. One watchman swore he had seen the flames bend away from Podrick as though repelled. A mother fell to her knees and called it a sign from the Seven. Another man uttered a prayer of thanks that the boy had been spared. Podrick, dazed and overwhelmed, hardly knew what to make of it. He felt pain, certainly, but also an odd sense of calm, as if he were exactly where he was meant to be. Later, he was treated for the burn, and the boy's grateful parents wept over him, calling him a savior. The story grew in the retelling. By nightfall, rumor had it Podrick had walked through an inferno unscathed. Some even claimed the father had appeared beside him, holding the flames at bay. Trying to escape the crowd of well-wishers, Podrick retired to a modest chamber in the Red Keep that evening. He found Brienne there, arms folded. She regarded him with a mixture of pride and worry. "Word travels fast," she said. "I heard you nearly got yourself killed." He forced a smile. "I'm not that hard to kill, apparently." Brienne shook her head. "You're braver than you think, Pod. But you must understand what this means now. The people are beginning to believe, more strongly than ever. Rumors of a blessed champion are spreading through the city." Podrick sat on a wooden stool, shoulders slumped. "I never asked for any of it. I was just trying to help." "That's why they believe," Brienne said gently. "A hero who doesn't seek glory is exactly the sort of hero the realm needs." Podrick exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "But I'm not a hero. I trip over my own feet, sire. If the Seven are blessing me, they've made a strange choice." Brienne gave a slight tilt of her head, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "The Seven have always favored the unlikely, have they not? Look at the legends. Duncan the Tall was once a hedge knight. Davos Seaworth was a smuggler who rose high, and many others were men and women of humble origins. Perhaps you're precisely the kind of person they want." Her words rattled around in Podrick's mind as he tried to sleep. That night, he dreamt of the maiden holding out a hand to him, guiding him through a battlefield strewn with corpses. The dream was filled with dread, yet the maiden's presence comforted him. When he woke, sweat slick on his brow, he wondered if it was a message or merely the result of all the talk of destiny. As the days wore on, he found himself sought out by supplicants. Men and women with all manner of woes approached, begging him to pray for them. A mother whose daughter lay dying of fever, a farmer whose crops refused to grow in the exhausted soil, a knight ashamed of past misdeeds who wanted absolution. Podrick tried to explain he had no special power, but desperation is a stubborn force. They pleaded, and he could not turn them away. Reluctantly, he listened to their stories, sometimes praying with them in hushed corners of the September. Other times, he offered only kind words and directed them to real healers or resources. And strangely enough, on occasion, their burdens seemed to lighten. The mother's daughter recovered after a maester administered a new remedy. The farmer's crops revived once the season turned and the rains came. The knight found redemption by choosing to guard a remote sept, devoting himself to the faith. Each success story, even if entirely coincidental, was attributed to Podrick. The city's people turned him into a figure of unwavering devotion and miraculous intervention. The High Septon, hearing these accounts, grew intrigued. Podrick found himself summoned for a quiet meeting in the newly rebuilt Great September. It was an intimidating occasion. He knelt before the High Septon, a slender man with intense eyes and a voice soft as silk. Behind him, statues of the Seven loomed, dappled by candlelight. Incense hung heavy in the air. The High Septon questioned Podrick about his life, his feats, the near-death escapes. Podrick answered as best he could, stumbling over explanations, emphasizing luck over divine favor. But the High Septon listened intently and finally said, "Sometimes the Seven choose vessels that do not see themselves as worthy. That is their way. In humility, the truest light shines." Podrick did not know how to respond. He only stared, his heart pounding. Then the High Septon offered something unexpected, formal recognition of Podrick as a chosen knight of the faith. It would be an honorific title, not a position of direct authority, but it would signify the faith's acknowledgement of his special grace. Podrick swallowed hard. The idea of stepping into such a role made him want to flee. Yet part of him, some small, uncertain part, felt an odd pull, as if the dream of the maiden beckoned him along a path of destiny. He begged for time to think, to which the High Septon kindly agreed. That evening, Podrick found no comfort in his bed. He wandered the halls of the keep, eventually stepping onto a balcony overlooking the city. Torches below glowed like scattered stars. It was quieter at night, though the distant clamor of taverns still reached his ears. He leaned on the railing, gazing out, wishing someone else could decide for him. But he was alone. So he prayed silently to the seven, asking if he should accept the High Septon's offer. Should he become some symbol of the faith, a champion for the small folk? In that stillness, he sensed no thunderous sign, no blazing comet. Yet a calm settled on his heart, similar to what he had felt each time he survived impossible odds. Perhaps the seven were guiding him, or perhaps it was the simpler truth that he wanted to bring solace to the suffering. Dawn broke with gilded light, and he found his mind was made up before he even realized it. He would accept tentatively, hoping it might allow him to do more good. Perhaps it was not truly the will of the gods, but if the end result helped the realm, so be it. The ceremony was a modest affair, held in the Great September with a handful of curious onlookers. Brienne was there, standing tall in silent support, a faint hint of pride in her usually stoic eyes. The High Septon performed a brief ritual, washing Podrick's hands with holy water, anointing his brow with blessed oil, and placing a small seven-pointed star on a chain around his neck. With these formalities, Podrick Payne was declared a Knight of the Seven's Grace, a newly crafted role signifying his peculiar standing. The onlookers cheered softly, but Podrick felt the weight of that star around his neck as if it were a millstone. In the days that followed, his tasks increased. The Faith set aside an area near the sept where Podrick could meet with those seeking comfort or counsel. He tried to keep it simple, offering prayers and gentle encouragement, always insisting he had no miraculous power. But people's hopes were not so easily tempered. More and more came, some traveling from villages days away. They asked him to bless their trinkets, to pray over them, to speak a prophecy of good harvest. Podrick had no prophecy to give. He only repeated the prayers he had learned, always concluding with, "If the seven will it." Still, coincidences abounded, enough to stoke the flames of belief. A feverish man claimed Podrick's touch alleviated his pain. A pregnant woman, previously told her birth would be fraught with difficulty, delivered a healthy babe after Podrick laid a hand on her swollen belly in. Dee prayed. What none of the observers realized was that a skilled midwife had taken charge of her care, and the mother herself had steeled her resolve. Nevertheless, Podrick's presence was woven into every hopeful outcome until it seemed indisputable that he was truly blessed. And so the legend grew. As his notoriety increased, Podrick felt torn. Yes, he wanted to help people. Yes, he believed in the power of faith to uplift the downtrodden. But he was not comfortable in this role of saintly figure. He was a simple squire, a boy who had stumbled from one near disaster to the next and emerged alive by sheer fortune or some strange cosmic design. He began to wonder if the aspect of the seven watching over him might be the stranger after all, leading him through one narrow escape after another as part of some cosmic jest. The thought chilled him, yet the realm did seem calmer. King's Landing, while not free of intrigue, was less volatile than in years past. The rebuilding continued, and fewer conflicts dotted the map. Podrick's gentle presence among the poor of the city brought them a measure of solace. Even petty thieves and ruffians grew shy about crossing the Knight of the Seven's Grace. For superstitious reasons, if nothing else, small acts of charity increased. Brienne, traveling between the Crownlands and the Stormlands on various tasks, heard from small folk that Podrick's prayers had helped them endure hardships. The question of destiny loomed large, but it seemed, for the moment, a destiny that revolved around healing and comfort rather than war and strife. Then came the rumor of Ironborn raids along the coast near the Blackwater Bay. The king's forces were dispatched to address it, but the Faith also insisted Podrick accompany them, to bless the endeavor. Podrick felt dread coil in his stomach, but he recognized that if he was to be a symbol, he could not remain ensconced in the safety of the September. He rode out with a contingent of soldiers and a few Faith militant. Their mission was to ensure the Ironborn either withdrew or were driven out. Podrick did not know how his presence might help, other than to offer prayers. They reached a small fishing village, battered by repeated raids. The men stationed there glowered, telling them the Ironborn had slipped away on their longships, plundering what they could. Families hid in shattered huts, children crying in fear. Podrick's heart broke at the sight of so many haunted faces. He spent hours talking with them, offering reassurances that the realm had not abandoned them. Some recognized him from whispered stories and seemed comforted just by his presence. Others were too weary to care. One old man shook his head at Podrick and said, "The gods let my family burn. What does your blessing matter now?" Podrick had no answer. That night, the Ironborn returned, more cunning than the Watchers had anticipated. They landed under the cover of darkness, intending to pillage once more. Screams tore through the night. Soldiers scrambled into their gear. Podrick, roused from a meager sleep, stumbled out of the makeshift shelter, sword in hand. He saw silhouettes of reavers descending on the village, torches lit, axes raised. Fear stabbed his gut. He was no brilliant warrior, but once again, something within him refused to remain idle. He rushed toward the nearest cluster of villagers. Several men were trying to push back an Ironborn reaver who swung a cruel axe, but they had no real training. Podrick lunged, blade meeting axe. The jarring impact nearly toppled him. He tried to hold his ground, but the reaver snarled, pressing forward. Podrick's arms shook. The reaver twisted the axe, hooking it around Podrick's sword, wrenching it aside. With a cry, Podrick lost his grip. He stumbled backward, and the reaver raised the axe high. That moment stretched in eternity. Podrick braced for the blow that would cleave him in two, and it never came. A flash of movement in the corner of his vision. A villager hurled a rock at the reaver's head, stunning him. Podrick, mind screaming at him to move, dropped to the ground and scrambled for his sword. The reaver recovered, spinning to hack at the villager, but the soldiers arrived then, thrusting spears. Within seconds, the reaver lay dead, and Podrick was still alive, heart pounding like a war drum. Another brush with death. Another miraculous reprieve. The villagers looked upon him with wide-eyed awe, as though certain the axe had missed because the gods themselves had stayed the reaver's hand. The fight spread through the village, pockets of flame lighting the blackness. Podrick, sword retrieved, joined in where he could, but every time he came face to face with a vicious foe, some twist of fortune saved him. A patch of mud caused an attacker to slip. A stray arrow from the Ironborn's own bowman felled a raider about to strike Podrick from behind, or a soldier came to Podrick's aid in just the right instant. By dawn, the Ironborn were routed, their longships departing in haste, leaving a handful of dead behind. The cost to the village was harsh, but not as catastrophic as it might have been. And Podrick, by all accounts, had waded through the thick of battle with only a shallow gash to his forearm. The villagers treated him as if he wore armor fashioned by the Seven themselves. Kneeling around him, they cried words of thanks. Soldiers from the capital regarded him with respect bordering on fear. Word would spread yet again. Podrick Payne had been in the thick of a brutal fight and emerged alive, an unstoppable chain of near misses and timely interventions. Podrick should have felt relief, yet all he felt was mounting pressure. In the aftermath, he struggled with the cries of the dying, the stench of blood, the sobs of children who had lost fathers or mothers. His so-called blessing did not save them. The gods had allowed carnage, as they always did, yet for reasons unknown they protected him. When he knelt by a woman keening over her dead husband's body, he had no comfort to offer. She stared at him, tears streaming, and demanded, "Why didn't your blessed sword save him?" Podrick had no answer. Her words cut deeper than any blade. In the silent gloom that followed the battle, Podrick withdrew, tears burning in his own eyes. He felt a crushing guilt for not having done more. If he truly was favored by the Seven, shouldn't he have been able to protect everyone? Why only himself? The question gnawed at him like a festering wound. On their return to King's Landing, he barely spoke. The soldiers praised him, telling tall tales about his unscathed valiance, but he heard only the woman's agonized lament. When he arrived at the Great September, the High Septon congratulated him on repelling the Ironborn. Podrick recounted how he had failed to save many, and the High Septon tried to soothe him with words about mortal limits and the god's grand design. But it did little to ease Podrick's turmoil. That night, alone by the altar of the maiden, he finally let the tears flow. He cried for the woman who had lost her husband, for the children orphaned by the Ironborn's axes, for every soul who prayed to the Seven in vain. And he cried for himself, the boy who should by all rights be among the dead, yet kept walking, kept breathing, kept trudging forward under a mantle of undeserved grace. His sobs subsided into ragged breathing. A faint voice seemed to echo in the recesses of his mind, or perhaps it was his heart. It told him that as long as he lived, he must keep trying. The world would never be free of suffering or war. Not even the gods could shield everyone from harm. But perhaps that did not diminish the miracle of a single life saved, or a single soul comforted. Perhaps the Seven's blessing, if that was indeed what it was, lay not in rewriting the laws of the world, but in giving hope to those who still drew breath. In that reflection, Podrick found a glimmer of purpose, and so he resolved to continue. If he was truly blessed, he would use that grace to stand between the helpless and harm, to offer solace where he could. He would not pretend to hold the power of life and death in his hands. He would only do what he had always done, serve faithfully. For in the darkness of this fragile peace, the realm needed every ray of light, every gentle voice, and every hand that would not turn away from the desperate. Podrick Payne might never fully understand why the Seven spared him so many times, but perhaps the reason was secondary to what he chose to do with that gift. In the weeks that followed, he dedicated himself anew to the simple tasks of kindness. He walked among the poorest districts of King's Landing, giving away bread and coin that others donated to him, blessing children with a smile and a prayer. He worked with Septons to set up an aid station for the sick, volunteering to carry fresh water and bed linens. He refused special privileges, declining offers of fine lodging in the keep. Instead, he took a room near the sept, humble and small, a reminder of the man he wanted to remain. Though people still flocked to him with a fervor that both overwhelmed and humbled him, he gently guided them toward practical help. He introduced them to healers, maesters, or other faithful who could address their needs more directly. In doing so, he became less a singular figure of miracles, more a living bridge between the faith and the common folk. It satisfied him to see results: children recovering from illness, mothers able to feed their families, young men finding honest work instead of turning to banditry. In each small victory, he felt a measure of redemption for all the horrors he had survived. Yet the realm was not done testing him. Rumors spread that beyond the narrow sea, new troubles brewed: mercenary companies clashing, exiled lords scheming. Podrick heard fragments of these tales from travelers, uncertain how they might tie into his life. He had enough to worry about here. Occasionally, he wondered if the day would come when some new cataclysm would drag him back onto the battlefield to test his improbable survival once more. But he did not fear it as he once had. If that day came, he would meet it with what courage he could muster, trusting that if the Seven willed him to stand he would. For now, though, his place was among the living, the hurting, the hopeful. When asked if he was truly blessed, he would only smile sadly and say, "I'm just Podrick Payne." And in that humble admission, the people found the answer they craved. He was not a grand knight from a storied lineage, not a golden warrior with a star-stamped sigil. He was a boy with big eyes and a timid smile, who had walked through war and fire and darkness and come out the other side still willing to help. That was a sort of blessing all its own. Time passed, and Podrick's reputation continued to grow. Some said he was an avatar of the Seven, others simply called him the bravest squire who ever lived. He had grown older, the lines of hardship marking his face, but the gentleness never left his eyes. If lords and ladies found it odd that the name Payne had become synonymous with protection rather than execution, they soon accepted it as another curious twist of fate. And as for Podrick himself, he made peace with the unknown. He prayed, yes, and sometimes the gods seemed close, other times distant. But with each prayer, he asked only for the strength to do what was right, not for any special favor. It was enough There were occasions when the old dread returned. In quiet moments, he would recall how many times he had stood at the threshold of death, feeling the stranger's presence behind him. He would wonder why the stranger passed him by. But then a new crisis would call him. A house fire in Flea Bottom, a skirmish in the outskirts, or a child in need of aid. And he would cast aside his doubts to face the moment. Time and again, fortune would favor him. With each new deliverance, the realm's reverence for him deepened, though Podrick himself never claimed to be anything more than a loyal servant. Perhaps that was the truest definition of faith, to act without knowing the reason behind every miracle. Late one evening, returning from the sept, Podrick paused by the courtyard of the Red Keep. Moonlight shone on the ancient stones. He remembered his earliest days there, a timid boy squire to Tyrion Lannister, overshadowed by cunning schemes and brash knights. He remembered the disbelief he felt when he survived the Blackwater, the wonder when Brienne took him under her wing, the terror and awe of Winterfell's long night. So many chapters of his life had led him to this place. He wondered what might come next. A breeze rustled past, carrying the faint scent of the sea. He closed his eyes, letting the night envelope him. In the stillness, a soft voice seemed to brush his consciousness. Whether it was the memory of Brienne's counsel, the echo of the High Septon's sermons, or a whisper from the Seven themselves, he could not say. It told him that survival in itself was not the end of his story. It was the beginning. He had been spared so many times not just to live, but to serve, to grow, to uplift others. Each rescue, each near miss, each stroke of unexplainable luck was a thread in the tapestry of his life's purpose. Bowing his head, Podrick felt a surge of quiet conviction. He would not shy away from that purpose. If the realm needed a living testament that hope could endure, he would be it, as best he could. Perhaps he would fail, perhaps his luck would one day run out, but until that day, he would not turn aside from the path laid before him. He opened his eyes, gazing up at the moonlit turrets, and a small, resolute smile curved his lips. He was no lord, no warrior of renown, but he was Podrick Payne, survivor, squire, champion by necessity rather than choice. If the Seven had chosen him, so be it. He would not boast of it. He would not shirk it. He would simply continue to do what he had always done. Place one foot in front of the other, help where he could, and serve faithfully until his last breath. No matter what storms brewed on the horizon, no matter what new threat rose from within or without the kingdom, Podrick would meet it head-on, believing that if a greater role awaited him, the Seven would show him the way. And as he turned from the courtyard, the moonlight glinted off the small seven-pointed star hanging from his neck. The light flickered for just an instant, too brief for any onlooker to notice, but long enough for Podrick to feel a warmth deep in his chest. Whether from faith or fate, he walked on with that subtle glow in his heart, bearing the quiet, enduring promise that his story was far from over.